Hi guys, we are about ready to start your Odyssey into the Odyssey, and I'm sure you've heard from upperclassmen a variety of things. You've heard it's really hard, you've heard it's not very hard. I thought it was going to be hard, but it wasn't very hard. Sometimes people say I really liked it, sometimes people will say I didn't like it at all. My guess is you'll like certain parts and other parts you won't find as interesting, because that's kind of how it is when you read a book. So we want to start off with an understanding of the qualities of what makes this an epic poem. Now, it is an epic poem. It's not a book, it's not a novel, it's not a drama, it's an epic poem. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then as we work through the different books of the Odyssey, we will look at the qualities that make it an epic poem. So let's talk a little bit about it. Many Homeric scholars think that Homer lived and worked about 760 BCE or later. He is believed to have been blind, and I want you to imagine him being led by a young servant into the great hall. All the major households would employ a singer or a storyteller like Homer. Matter of fact, he weaves the storytellers into his own story. So in Book 2, Phemius sings of Odysseus' adventures. And in Book 8, blind Demodocus, the matchless singer, brings tears to Odysseus' eyes. So Odysseus is in the room, disguised, but Demodocus is singing of this great hero Odysseus, and no one realizes that he's in their midst. And in the later books, when Odysseus reclaims his throne and punishes the wrongdoers, who do you think survives his wrath? So let's talk about, as you read the opening book together, and a book is merely a chapter in the Odyssey. So as you read the opening chapter together, I want you to imagine a storyteller like Donna Washington telling the story. You can't, well, I guess you can. You can read it really slow and boring and methodical, and it'll lose all of its energy. But I want you to imagine that Homer is being led into the great hall by a young servant. The servant would help him find his seat and then hand him his lyre, which is like a little mini harp, and the poet would begin to sing. This format would be really familiar to his audience in a way that it's not to ours. Another thing to keep in mind is that as an epic poem, it has long set speeches or monologues. A monologue is a solo speech which is usually 10 lines or more. Look at Telemachus's lines on pages 10 and 11. And then look at Athena's speeches on pages 12, 13, and 14. This single speech goes clear on to the next page. Now, in a modern drama, this wouldn't make sense. But think back to Donna Washington. She told the whole story herself, just like Homer would have. And this style of using long monologues would be familiar to the audience. Now, he could read the passages with one intention, but it would be boring. And there are lots of little shifts in here, lots of different thoughts and probably different movements that you could imagine Telemachus doing. And Homer would probably be mimicking that through his voice and through his own movement. So when I'm working with something like this and I find my mind drifting, I like to break up the long speeches and think about how I might act them out. One of the things I like to think about as a performer is, what is my action, or what is my intention, and how do I bring that action forward to my audience? So I think about the intention behind each line, or the action. Telemachus' response was wise and precise. I think he's saying to Athena, you ask a good question. Now, he doesn't know it's Athena. He sees an old man in front of him, someone who has presented himself as an old friend of his father's, and he would have never met Mentor, but he would have heard stories about him. So it starts off and he says, "Dear guest, to all you ask I now reply. You ask a good question, I'll give you an answer." And then there's a pride in his voice, is how I see this. "I tell you that as long as he, my father, was in his native land, this house was rich and great." Oh, and then there's a but. Whenever you see a but in a sentence, you want to pay attention to it, because the intention is going to change. "But then the gods willed otherwise. They made my father vanish. They devised oblivion for him, much deeper than the oblivion known by any other man. And though he's dead, my grief would be less deep if he had fallen in the land of Troy." In other words, if he had died a hero. And I want to go back up here and draw your attention to the dash. all the way through here, the editors of this particular piece, and perhaps Mandelbaum himself, are giving you indications about how to read it. When you have a dash like that, you want to pause, and I may not have given it a deep enough pause because it's a contemplation. We call these interrupters when we're analyzing language. They're also called parentheticals sometimes, even though they're not in parentheses. They're indicating that an idea is coming, but it can also be an indication that you need to pause and slow down. Okay? So it goes into, they made my father vanish. They devised oblivion for him, much deeper than oblivion known by any other man. Notice the they, okay? And I think that this goes back to the epic question that is being asked. Why do men blame gods for their own decisions and the results of their own actions? It's kind of a cool idea. All right, and then you can kind of go on through the rest of this. But by the end of this, I think he's talking with a disgust that his father is dead and his father is not being honored. So perhaps something that his father did caused him not to return. And that makes Athena angry, as we see on the next page. So when she starts to talk, it comes back and it says that she was incensed. She replies angrily, and all the cues are in the text. Now, let's get this clear. Do I expect you to mark your book like this? Of course not. You're not writing a screenplay or acting this out. But when you read, if in your mind you can think like Homer or think like an actor and look for those cue words, it's going to be much easier, much more enjoyable to read. Verbs are your friends when you're reading a piece like this. One of the things you'll want to keep near you when you're working on your study guides is the characteristics of epic literature. And there's some terms I want us to talk about that would have been very familiar to an ancient audience that are not as familiar to us. So the first is that the audience would expect the story to begin in medias res, in the middle of things. It's not ab ovo, which means at the beginning. If it were at the beginning, then it would start with the end of the Trojan War. And we're actually 9, almost 10 years into the Trojan War. So when Odysseus first left to go to the Trojan War, Telemachus was just a little boy. He was just a baby. And now he's 19, almost 20 years old. And so he doesn't remember much about his father. And for some students, this part of the storytelling process becomes a little bit confusing because the first 4 books are really Telemachus' story, and he is explaining what is happening back in Ithaca, Odysseus' homeland. And so he is setting us up and bringing us into the current moment by explaining what has happened in the 19 years that Odysseus has been away. We don't even meet Odysseus until book 5. And then the next 5 books are spent with Odysseus in flashback, telling the story and catching everyone up from the time that they left Troy until this present moment. Then we're going to be reunited on Ithaca. But that doesn't happen until quite a ways into the story. So keep that in mind. Another thing that the audience would be very familiar with that seems really awkward and forced to us are the use of epithets. And an epithet is a descriptive phrase describing a character. You're going to see them all the way through. Odysseus is man of many wiles. Telemachus, astute and wise. Ino is the goddess with the lovely ankles. Athena is the gray-eyed goddess. Interesting the way that men are described and the way that women are described. So you might pay attention to that as you go. Let's talk about the conventions and characteristics of an epic poem, the elements that make it an epic poem and not another kind of literature. So first of all, the definition of an epic is a long narrative. Narrative is a story, usually a poem, written in exalted and dignified style. So exalted is almost heavenly. It's not written in common language the way that you and I would typically converse. It focuses on a heroic or a semi-divine figure whose actions determine the fate of a people, a nation, or all humanity. Now, when we talk about that, a hero typically cannot be common born. So you and I would not typically be a hero. There has to be something in our birth, something in our past, something in our lineage that makes us heroic. Perhaps we're a god or goddess, and like Percy Jackson, we don't know that we're a demigod. We don't know that our father is really Poseidon. But a typical everyday person cannot rise to the level of a hero. So other epic conventions include the man or woman has to be of great national or cosmic importance. The scale is huge. The whole known world is usually involved. Battles abound. The hero and others perform superhero deeds, and the gods participate, often taking sides for capricious reasons. And capricious means for your own enjoyment. It's not for the betterment of humankind. The gods just get involved to have fun with these humans. And then the language of the epic is deliberately artificial, so not real, not language that we would typically speak with, archaic, old-fashioned, and lofty, another word for exalted. When you get to the next list underneath it, those are characteristics, and most epics will have those elements, but not all of those elements need to be met for it to be an epic. I have read this epic poem several times with several different instructors, both at the high school and the college level, and the names are pronounced different ways because they're all Greek to us. So for class, we're going to use these pronunciations: Homer, Athena, Zeus, Telemachus or Telemachus, Penelope, Athena, and she will appear in the first several books as disguised as an old friend of Odysseus, a friend that Telemachus would have heard of but never would have met. And in disguise, she is mentor, but she is also mentis. M-E-N-T-E-S will be the same person. And then the two suitors, Antinous and Eurymachus. Now, using your word within a word skills, which of these two do you think uses smooth and lovely words in order to manipulate? His words say one thing, but he's really a conniving individual behind them. And which of these two do you think always speaks with a harsh and bold and angry in angry words? He's almost aggressive every time he speaks. Finally, I want you to know that the Greeks will be referred to in several different ways as well. You'll hear them referred to as the Greeks, as the Argives, and as the Achaeans. They're all different names for different bands within Greece. So what's your goal as you work through this epic poem? Is it to read and understand every single word? No, it's not. You should be able to understand the elements of an epic. You should be able to find most of those within the text. You should get better at reading this formal epic poem that is written in an exalted style, and you'll find that it just gets easier as you go. And to understand some of the major stories that have existed since written word was written down. This story actually precedes written word, written language. And you will be reading the same text that students have read for thousands of years. We have to see if human beings have changed all that much in all that time.